Well, that's a fine-looking congregation. I don't usually get to see your smiling faces from my usual roost in the back. Usually I'm assessing haircuts. Well, up to this point, we've been focusing in on the Transgender Day of Remembrance. It's a dark and disturbing subject, and I thank you for your forbearance as we remembered the transgender lives that were needlessly lost to violence. In addition to this being Transgender Day of Remembrance, it's also the end of Transgender Awareness Week. That's a week when transgender people and their allies take action to bring attention to the trans community by educating the public about who transgender people are and by sharing stories and experiences of the community members. In addition, the goal is to increase awareness around the issues of prejudice, discrimination, and violence that affect the transgender community. So with that mission in mind, let me lay some transgender awareness on you this morning. It's been reported that a bit more than 1% of the nation's adult population identifies as being transgender. That's equivalent to about 2.6 million adult Americans. To put it in perspective, there are 13 U.S. states with fewer than 2.6 million citizens. So we could have our own state. So there's a lot out there, of us, especially considering the number is probably understated, since there's a significant population of transgender individuals who, for the many reasons, cannot publicly risk acknowledging the fact that they're transgender. And for many years, I was one of them. Nationwide, about 44% of people surveyed say they personally know somebody who's transgender. Happily, here at Mill Creek, everyone knows multiple transgender people. And I can tell you from personal experience, this congregation is so very welcoming and is so very gracious and supportively in so many ways. Personally, that unwavering acceptance gave me a home for my trans spirit and emboldened me to transition to being Diane full-time at the beginning of 2018, shortly after I retired from a long business career. For that kindness, I will be forever grateful to this welcoming congregation. In that regard, I'd be remiss by not acknowledging my Chalice Circle sisters who took in this poor stranger in a strange land and welcomed her into their lives and their covenant, and they have made my life so much fuller and so much more joyous. Nearly 2/3 of U.S. adults said that they would be comfortable if their child came out to them as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. That compares to only half of all adults who said that they would be comfortable if their child came out to them as transgender. With that 50% acceptance number in mind, it is encouraging that it was also reported that 72% of all adults said that they're confident that they'd be able to understand and support their child if they came out as transgender. While 72% seems to be something of a passing grade, that leaves more than a quarter of the families with some level of intolerance, and that leaves an awfully lot of trans youth at risk. When someone comes out as transgender to their family, it can be a jarring revelation. For the trans individual who's been struggling and thinking about their gender identity for years, the shedding of the weight of harboring that struggle in secret can be a huge relief. With the advent of the information age, the ability of a trans person to explore what it means to be trans and to make online connections has, in most cases, armed them with a pretty good understanding of the subject. Generally, a trans individual has some expectations as to how their revelation will be received. But there are definitely cases where there's a pleasant surprise of acceptance or a demoralizing, heart-wrenching rejection by someone you thought would be supportive. Sometimes family members have had some kind of inkling that something's going on with the child, usually has to do with underwear. And the announcement doesn't come as a complete surprise. But in some cases, when a trans person, at the cost of great personal anxiety and stress, has for years force themselves to project a gender normative persona to the world, the family is blindsided and is shaken. It's a lot to take in all at once. One might think that transitioning is mostly a personal journey of transformation. Of course, it is to some degree. But when a youth comes out to their parents and makes the revelation, the whole family goes through a transformative experience, something much like the 5 stages of grief. Denial, this can't be happening. What the hell are you talking about? Anger, why'd this happen? Who's to blame? It's got to be your side of the family. Bargaining, make this not happen and I'll take you to Disney World. Depression, I can't bear this, I can't even think about this. I'm too sad to even think. Acceptance. I acknowledge that this is real and happening, and we need to embrace it and move forward. Of course, not all families go through all those stages, and it's not a linear sequence of events, but it does force a family into deep introspection and test the strengths of the very bond of the family. Then there's the case of the married adult trans person coming out to their spouse. That can be a bit trickier for several reasons. Unlike the parent-child relationships that's a genetic and genealogical bond, marriages are social contracts that are made and broken with great regularity. In fact, 50% of first marriages result in divorce. When an adult spouse announces that they are transgender, it can shake the very foundation of foundation of the traditional heterosexual bond. First, there can be a sense of betrayal. Why didn't you think to tell me about this before we got married? Or, so you deceived me, and you're not the person I thought you were. As you would imagine, addressing these topics can lead to some highly emotionally charged discussions. Second, it can affect the sexual aspect of the marital bond. How does this change our heterosexual relationship arrangement? That leads to some tough questions and lots of soul searching on the part of both partners. I can tell you from personal experience, it takes a lot of time and effort to navigate through those stormy seas. It tests the bond, the commitment, and the self-awareness of both partners. Even when the relationship withstands that trial, the interpersonal relationship and the partners themselves are forever changed. Okay, let's talk about some other aspects of transgender awareness. Since the 2020 elections, 22 transgender candidates have been elected to public office. Those include our very own Sarah McBride, who was first elected to the Delaware State Senate in 2020. She was the first transgender state senator in the United States in U.S. history. Well done, Delaware. Not to sit on her laurels, it appears that Sarah McBride has opened up a more than 20-point lead in her bid to represent Delawareans in Congress, and if elected, she'll become the nation's first openly transgender member of the U.S. Congress. Go, Sarah. Vote. So far in this off-cycle election year, we've added 3 new transgender elected officials to the list. Claire Kilman was elected to be the first transgender city council member in the state of Illinois. Olivia Hill was elected to be the first transgender elected official in all of red state Tennessee. And just this month, Danica Rome was elected to be the first transgender state senator in Virginia's history, and second to Sarah. So there's no denying that transgender individuals can work within the system to affect change in the society. On the legal side of the transgender rights Rubik Cube, we find good news, bad news dichotomy. There is no federal law designating being transgender as a protected class or requiring equal treatment for transgender people. Of course, given that we can't seem to pass an equal rights amendment for 50% of the population, that shouldn't be a big surprise. On the other hand, in 225 jurisdictions, including 25 U.S. states, there's legislation that prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender identity in employment, housing, or public accommodations. Of course, one of my favorite exercises in mental masturbation is the numerous jurisdictions and states that have passed or consider passing so-called bathroom bills, which restrict the use of bathrooms by transgender people, forcing them to choose a facility in accordance with their biological sex. This includes the states of Arizona, Kentucky, Florida, and Texas. So think about this. If Sarah McBride is elected to the U.S. Congress and visits Texas on a fact-finding junket in conjunction with her responsibility as a congresswoman, she could still be arrested for using the wrong bathroom. It just doesn't seem right, does it? While talking about disingenuous politicians, many from the same camps that are hell-bent on restricting a woman's right to choose, we find disinformation peddling extremists hounding lawmakers in state houses across the country to introduce and pass legislation that severely restricts or prohibits gender-affirming care for transgender youth. Those mendacious peddlers of lies try to portray that transgender youth are being surgically mutilated. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The truth is, young people seeking transition-related medical care first receive significant counseling and psychological assessment. Puberty-blocking medications and hormone therapy for trans youth and adults have been prescribed and studied for 40 years. Those medications simply delay development. If those medications are stopped, puberty will continue. For young children, gender transition is a social transition, often involving a haircut, a new name, and new clothes to match their gender identity. For adolescents, any medical transition, such as hormone therapy or puberty blockers, are only prescribed based on the individual young person's need. Despite the true facts, 7 states have enacted laws banning gender-affirming care, and 10 other states are in some stage of passing legislation banning gender-affirming care. In addition, the Florida Board of Medicine, in their infinite wisdom, forbade gender-affirming care last year via administrative action. And incredibly, last year, the Texas governor directed the state officials to investigate anyone providing gender-affirming care by parents, doctors, or others as child abuse. What a genuine lack of compassion at the hand of political pandering. These laws are devastating both to children and the families who sometimes find that they have to move to another state in order to procure life-saving medical care for their child and avoid huge financial burdens and costs. For a young transgender person being denied proper medical and psychological support, that denial can be emotionally and psychologically devastating. Instead of handling the LGBTQ youth suicide situation as an urgent public health crisis, politicians continue to pander to special interest groups for financial gain. It's a crisis. Consider LGBTQ plus youth are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their peers. The Trevor Project estimates that 1.8 million LGBTQ plus youth seriously consider suicide each year in the U.S. At least one attempts suicide every 45 seconds, with 525,600 minutes in a year. That kind of needless carnage caused by intolerance is gut-wrenching. There's so much more that I'd like to share with you this morning, but there just isn't enough time to talk about everything. The stupidity of book banning. It's practically a page out of Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 novel. The great novels and inspiring biographies by and about transgender people, which are now readily available. The strides in making transgender characters and actors that play them visible and real by the stage and film industry communities. the outreach and support of trans people by great entities like Planned Parenthood. So to wrap this up, this is what I'll leave you with today. First, if anyone ever wants to talk about trans topics, I and several others in the congregation would be happy to sit down with you and share our stories and our knowledge with you or someone you know. Second, thanks for your forbearance and listening to me rattle on about transgender awareness this morning. I truly appreciate the offer to offer this morning's service. And lastly, I leave you with a plea for love, support, to embrace our transgender youth. While politicians and religious right carelessly use them as pawns, we need to stand with them as they raise up their collective voices on social media and organize groups demanding to know, what about us?